Well, good evening. Thanks for being with us. Donald Trump continues to question the legitimacy of Joe Biden's win in the presidential election with a series of lawsuits in many critical swing states. As it stands, the president has launched 30 different lawsuits in an attempt to challenge and even overturn the result that went for Biden. He's claiming Biden only won because millions of his votes were cast illegally. So far, of course, no evidence has been found of widespread voter fraud, and most of the lawsuits have been thrown out, withdrawn, or settled. Throughout his tenure as president, one of his most outspoken critics has been his own niece, Mary Trump. Is a psychologist and author of the book Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. And Mary Trump is with me now. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's nice to talk to you, Mary. The world's most dangerous man, really?
Well, I think we're seeing that play out, in not just in terms of how he's handling this incredible crisis of COVID-19, which killed 2,000 Americans yesterday, but in terms of how he is failing to handle a peaceful transition of power, thereby undermining the most powerful democracy on the planet. It's quite tragic. And I think if we had 4 more years of Donald in the Oval Office, he would have created situations that were tragic for the entire world. So I think between his psychological instability and his incompetence and the fact that, you know, in modern times, the leader of America has been considered the most powerful person on the planet. That's a pretty dangerous combination.
Did you ever get on with him?
Oh yeah, we got along. We got along just fine. Generally speaking, in my family, it's not like people were really, really close. Probably the only person I was close with was my grandmother. But Donald and I had a quite cordial relationship, and he actually hired me to write his 3rd book for him.
So take me back then to, when he was growing up. What created the Donald Trump who we know? Were there life-defining moments in his life that created what we now know him to be?
There were indeed. He started out with the disadvantage, as did his siblings, of having a father, my grandfather, who was a sociopath, somebody who did not understand human love or connection or kindness. However, that circumstance might have been mitigated if his mother, my grandmother, had been available to him. But unfortunately, when Donald was 2.5, my grandmother became very ill and was essentially absent from his life for almost a year. 2.5 is an incredibly crucial developmental period. And for that year, he felt abandoned by her because he could not understand what had happened. He just knew that she was gone from his life, and there was nobody to take her place. So for several months, he was essentially alone and terrified, and there was nobody to comfort him or see him in any deep way. And he never recovered from that, quite honestly.
Did he ever talk about it?
No. Most people in my family don't really talk about things. Also, he was quite young. So
most people in your family don't talk about things. What's that about?
It's, that comes from my grandfather. It's considered weakness to have feelings of sadness. It's weakness to doubt yourself or admit your mistakes or make mistakes. So Donald learned early on that pretty much the worst thing you could be was weak, to be a loser, and he knew that he needed to put on this particular armor in order to avoid my father's fate, which was to be abused and eventually dismissed by his father. So Donald had to become the tough guy, the guy who was willing to lie, cheat, or steal to win at all costs, and the guy who would never admit he was wrong and always had to be the best at everything.
And was he like that even as a young man?
Yeah, by the time he was 12, my dad called him the great I am because he was already so full of himself. So this has been going on for a really long time, and he's never really changed much.
Shortly after the 2016 election, you've said that you saw him being particularly cruel as to how he treated your dad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Sure. My father was the oldest son, the oldest Trump son, and he was my grandfather's namesake, Fred Jr. He was also 7.5 years older than Donald, and he was supposed to take over my grandfather's real estate empire. But for whatever reason, my grandfather found my father to be lacking in some way, put an enormous amount of pressure on him, never treated him with any respect. And when my dad, who had actually been working for my grandfather right out of college, when he decided he couldn't really take it anymore, he became a professional pilot, which in 1964 was a really big deal, as it was the dawn of the jet age. My grandfather treated this as if my dad had decided to, sell drugs or something, and referred to him as a glorified bus driver, which crushed my father. And he became, it's not the only reason, but that because of that pressure and disappointment, he started having trouble with alcohol and never really recovered from that. And Donald never treated my father with anything but contempt. And I think that added to my dad's despair.
Your father died at the age of 43, with alcoholism being a factor, Mary.
Yes, he was 42, actually, which is quite young. And he was living with my grandparents at the time. And after being sick for a couple of weeks, they sent him to the hospital by himself. And while my dad was lying in the hospital dying alone, his parents stayed in their house, and Donald and my Aunt Elizabeth went to the movies.
And he took away your family's health insurance, didn't he?
Yes, he did. When my grandfather died in 1999, we found out that, I found out that I had been disinherited. So it was as if my dad had never existed. And it didn't seem particularly fair to me, since I knew that my family had quite a bit of money. So I sued them. I sued my grandfather's estate, I should say. And in retaliation, my aunts and uncles took away our health insurance, which had been provided to all of us through my grandfather's company for our entire lives. So it was an act of retaliation, which would have been, bad, I suppose, if it had only affected me, although I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. The problem was my nephew, who was 6 months old at the time, was suffering from life-threatening seizures and needed around-the-clock nursing care. So they were perfectly willing to endanger my nephew's life even further by withdrawing all of our health care.
When you then saw Donald Trump, he has this aura around him where he tells you he's successful, even if he's not. And that can be very infectious. How many people around him actually believe him, who he considers to be his friends? Or have they all got the take on him? Do they all know what's going on, or are they seduced by him?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is it's both. Some people really buy into it because one thing I can say about Donald is that he does have a certain kind of charisma in one-on-one. And there's a certain kind of person who's taken in by that. And because, let's face it, despite his serial failures throughout his entire life, he's always had somebody to buy his way out of it. So he has, against all odds, ascended to the Oval Office. So there's a reason for some people to believe that he actually was successful. On the other hand, though, there are people who are much savvier than Donald is, who understand exactly who he is. But one of the things my grandfather did was turn Donald into a weak person who is eminently useful to smarter, more powerful people. So there's a certain class of, as particularly in the Republican Party, of people who believe that they can use Donald towards their own ends, even if it means sucking up to him and flattering him.
He likes revenge, doesn't he? I can see that. I watch all of his press conferences. I do all of that. And if someone crosses him, he likes revenge.
He does indeed. And unfortunately, he has a level of power that makes that dangerous to individuals. I mean, we have seen in the last 4 years how poorly whistleblowers have fared. I mean, these are patriotic Americans who've been doing their jobs, and all of a sudden, because they told the truth that was inconvenient for Donald, he has called them out, and suddenly they're getting death threats and they're getting fired and they're having to retire because they are getting so much abuse. And we're seeing this play out during this horrible transition we're going through right now.
What are his weaknesses in terms of that he recognizes? Because we all have insecurities that are in our own heads, every single one of us. What do you reckon his are in his head?
One of Donald's biggest problems is that he does not recognize them, or he at least cannot acknowledge them, which makes him even weaker, because he's never willing to adjust or course correct. He can never be wrong. He can never be anything but a winner. He always has to know more than everybody else. And obviously none of those things is possible. So it puts him in this very tricky situation where he has to believe that those things are true, but they're not. So he actually never knows enough. He's never good enough. He's never strong enough. And the truth of the matter is he is underneath it all a very weak, insecure person, which is why he has this, as you said, aura of success and aura of belligerence and level of self-confidence that is not at all borne out by who he really is.
What type of a dad is he?
My cousins are a lot younger than I am, much younger. So I didn't grow up when they were growing up, I was already in my 20s. So I only got to see them with Donald when they were pretty young. My sense, though, is that their relationship with him is very much like Donald's relationship with his own father, which is to say, it's transactional and it's conditional. So they're always trying to figure out what they can get out of it. And his kids also know quite well that if they want to keep, getting anything from him, if they want to keep living in the lifestyle to which they've become accustomed, which is solely provided by Donald, they are going to have to do whatever he expects them to do. They are going to have to continue to be of use to him, which is why in the situation we're in right now, they're not going to do anything to upset him. They're not going to be encouraging him in any real way to accept the loss of this election and move on.
But he's very close to his children, isn't he? Because it seems to be that you can sense that's who he trusts, and that he might not trust a lot of other people around him.
Yeah, but it also depends on what you mean by close. He they're his kids, so he keeps them close. And again, they rely on him entirely. But it's not as if they confide in each other or talk about their feelings. It's as I said, it's very transactional. And it seems to me that they're perfectly willing to, sacrifice their autonomy and maybe even suspend their better judgment just to appease him. I just found out that my cousin Donnie just tested positive for COVID-19, largely because he knows that in order to avoid his father's wrath, he's not going to follow any COVID protocols. And here he is now testing positive for COVID-19.
But come on, he's, Donald Trump Jr., he's experiencing no symptoms. The spokesperson for the president's son has said, it's actually on the news wires tonight, but he's his own person. He can make his own decisions, can he not?
Look, I'm not at all trying to let him off the hook for anything. Yes, if he's an adult human being, he can make his own decisions. My point is that he has made the calculation that it's more important to him to stay in his father's good graces than it is to be his own man.
I sometimes, Mary, look at Barron, and what age is Barron? 14. And I wonder, my goodness, all the fragility that we've all had when we were 14, what type of life does he have in the middle of all of this?
I think, honestly, I never met Barron because he was born after I was disinherited. I think it's any child growing up under those circumstances in the White House. It's difficult for anybody, whether it's Chelsea Clinton or the Obama's kids. It's a tough situation in which to grow up. So, my hope for any child in that situation is that they are able to transition back to a somewhat normal life, or at least compared to living in the White House, once they leave.
Have you noticed or witnessed any Trump meltdowns? Have you seen the anger?
It's interesting. Growing up, Donald was always the favorite son, the favorite child. He always got his way. So there wasn't really any reason for him to melt down. There was nothing ever went wrong. My grandfather was always there, having his back, bailing him out, throwing money at him. Although, it was clear, my grandfather, although he showed it very rarely, had quite a temper. And you could see, even though generally speaking, Donald was always in pretty good shape, he did not like getting crossed, that's for sure. So I imagine right now his being in this unique position of having, for the first time in his life, lost in a way that he cannot change, is causing all sorts of meltdowns, because it isn't just anger, it's fear. He knows that without the power of the Oval Office protecting him, he's facing potential bankruptcy. Maybe not bankruptcy, but he has huge amounts of debt that will be called in. He's facing potential prosecution. He's facing a lot of lawsuits. So I'm guessing there's a lot of melting down going on.
I'm hoping you can stay with me for just another minute or two. I know you're busy tonight. Do you think he'll run in 2024 again?
I think that's extraordinarily unlikely for a couple of reasons. First of all, he will never put himself in a position of losing again, which would, of course, be a possibility if he ran again. It would also require him to be in a kind of subordinate supporting role for 4 years, which I think would be intolerable. It would be kind of doing a favor for the Republican Party, which he's not a particular fan of at the moment. And I think he's much more likely to pursue something in the media that kind of keeps the spotlight trained on him in a way he's comfortable with. But he needs to leave the White House before we're going to find that out, right?
Do you despise him?
No, I despise what he's done to my country and the people in it. I think he's an awful person. I think he never should have been in this position. He never should have had this kind of power. But I don't despise him. I do, however, believe that he is responsible for a lot of horrible things, and he needs to be held accountable.
And finally, Mary, he said, he will be aware that he's got just another couple of months of power left. What do you predict he will do as he sees that power grip that he's got easing away from his clutches? Like, what's he going to do in his last weeks of power?
It's a little frightening to contemplate that. Because who knows what's going on behind the scenes? We have no access to that. And Donald knows all of the United States' most closely guarded secrets. He's a desperate man who's in an enormous amount of debt. So I don't know what kind of deals he might be making. I also worry that, especially as he sees his options dwindling, as you mentioned, none of these lawsuits has been successful. None of them would have changed the results of the election anyway. States are starting to call the election definitively for Joe Biden. So that's going to make him feel even more cornered. And I think he will dedicate a fair amount of his time to delegitimizing the incoming administration in a way that will be bad for all of us, because we really need to be able to move on from this. And we won't be able to if Donald is trying to convince millions of people that, this election was rigged against him somehow, which it most definitely was not.
We've really enjoyed talking to you tonight. Your book is called Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. And thank you very much indeed for joining us on the BBC tonight, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.